This week, Stephen Bay, Director of Security Operations at Security On Demand, is here to talk about insider threats. In our second segment, we welcome Patrick Laverty, from the conference organizer at Layer 8, and Ori Zingader, co-founder of WorkshopCon, to discuss all things Layer 8 Conference and WorkshopCon. In the security news, Zoom is set to release 5.0, an update that has security and privacy improvements, go figure. Zero-click, zero-day flaws in iOS Mail exploited to hijack VIP smartphones. NSA shares a list of vulnerabilities in commonly exploited plant web shells. Wow, that was a mouthful. Legions of cybersecurity volunteers rally to protect hospitals during the COVID-19 crisis, and the top 10 in-demand cybersecurity jobs in the age of coronavirus. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man that does not keep hand sanitizer in that pump bottle next to the bed. Nope. Lube. Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode 648, recorded on April 23rd, 2020, right here in G-Unit Studios. Well, I'm here in G-Unit Studios. Everyone else is safely distanced, either in the next room or on the lines via Skype or Zoom. Mr. Larry Pesci, of course, is here with us. Larry, welcome.
Howdy, howdy. And look, there's the lube right there. I mean, the hand sanitizer.
Yes. We've actually refilled this with hand sanitizer. I don't know if you can see it behind me, but there is, yeah.
Yeah. The 55-gallon drum of hand sanitizer.
Yes.
Because you used all of it.
We used all the lube. Remember that big episode? Anyway. Also on the lines remotely, Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome.
I'm feeling very dry all of a sudden. I can't.
It's all that hand sanitizer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nice to be here as usual.
Nice to have you. Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Good to be here from a sunny day out here in Idaho. And Captain Obvious moment, the alcohol-based hand sanitizer is flammable.
Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Careful with that, Lee. Are you lighting fires out? You know what? I'm not sure why you're lighting hand sanitizer on fire. Mr. Tyler Robinson.
Not at liberty to disclose that.
That's Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thank you. Lube, fire, and hand sanitizer. I don't know where this is going tonight.
I mean, that's a way to social distance. If you make a circle of hand sanitizer around yourself and then light it on fire, that would keep me away anyway. Maybe. We'll see. I don't know. Tyler's so good looking, I might risk it to come in for a hug. So, quick announcements. We've migrated our mailing list back to the original platform. We do apologize for anyone who may have gotten double mailings or those mailings you might have missed in the interim. We do have the security and hacking topics nailed down to 55, and that lets us customize your preferences. You can go to securityweekly.com/subscribe, click the button to join the list, and you will get tailored updates that are in accordance with your interests in security. That is, those are 55 security categories. So make sure you go do that, securityweekly.com/subscribe. All of our other shows are there as well. We do have lots of other shows on the network. You can find them all on that page. Stephen Bay, who is here with us, stepped out for a moment. He does have 16 years of cybersecurity experience, spanning the military, government, consulting, and enterprise security. For 10 of those years, he supported the National Security Agency as a member of the military and a contractor. In 2013, he hired Edward Snowden to a contract position in Hawaii and was his manager when Snowden fled the country with the top secrets of the NSA. Stephen, welcome to the program today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Yes, nice to have you. Now, Stephen did an interview on Enterprise Security Weekly. But Stephen, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of maybe quickly answer some of the burning questions on people's minds. I know it takes you probably about an hour, maybe more, to go through the entire story. If you do want to hear all those details, we do have an Enterprise Security Weekly segment that we did. But like many, when I first found out, Stephen was Edward Snowden's manager when all that stuff went down, the questions just started in my mind. So maybe give a quick synopsis for our audience.
Yeah, I mean, it was a supremely surreal experience, right? You never think, despite all the trainings you go through at NSA about security and about counterintelligence and ways to protect yourself, that you're going to be involved in a situation like this. And, as things really went down, the whole situation with Snowden really evolved very quickly, at least from my perspective, right? I met him 2.5 months before he fled the country. He was only an employee of mine for a month and a half. And it really goes to show how quickly, an insider threat, any sort of thing like that can snowball, and how quickly things can get out of hand. And so, it's about a month in when he told me that he was sick and he was going to be taking some time off for medical leave. And he ultimately fled the country with all of that data. And it was another 2 or 3 weeks till I ever heard from him again. The next time I heard from him was the same time we all heard from him, which was when the first story started being released off of the internet. So it was a supremely surreal experience that really changed the course of my life in many ways, taught me very many valuable lessons in cybersecurity, insider threat, crisis management, you name it. And it's just one of those things that I happen to be kind of caught in the middle of.
Now, Stephen, what I found interesting is when I asked you this question, when we first met, it still is a very intriguing thing, and it's one question that burns on our minds, and your answer was very surreal. And that is, did you have any idea when Edward Snowden worked for you that he would be the Edward Snowden that did all that stuff to the NSA and walked out with secrets, right? And I just think your whole perspective on that is very telling.
Yeah, sure. So no, I had no clue. And in fact, the day before Snowden revealed himself to be the man he was, so that was June 9th was the day he kind of came out in the open and revealed that he was behind the leaks. The day before that, he'd been missing. The NSA leaks had gone out. I never made the connection at all that he would be the guy behind those leaks. And it was a friend of mine who said, hey, wouldn't it be crazy if Ed were the guy leaking this stuff? And to me, it was a preposterous idea. I know I didn't know Ed extremely well, but I knew him as well as anybody else that worked with him at the time. And to me, it was preposterous. And I thought there was no chance on earth that Ed would be the guy behind it. And sure enough, he was. And as I've kind of looked back at the situation since then, I've thought about what are those red flags and what are those things I should have looked for? And there really aren't many, right? I once was in an interview with 2 or 3 years ago, and they asked, if would you hire him again? And I said, well, of course not, knowing what I know now, right? But knowing what I knew at the time I hired him, there's no reason not to, right? There weren't the big red flags. There weren't, his technical acumen was there. He's an extremely technical person. In fact, as I thought about those red flags, the only kind of 2 things that popped up that I thought was remotely weird, but nothing to make this logical leap from, being a trusted security clearance holding NSA analyst to fleeing to China and leaking out millions of documents, right, was he asked 2 or 3 times how to get access to a compartmentalized intelligence program that he later stole information on and released out. that he did not have access to. But it wasn't a terribly unreasonable request, because in many respects, his office should have been in some regard using that access and that program. And their parent offices out in Maryland and other places were doing so. Then the second one was when he didn't want to take short-term disability. Instead, he just wanted to go on leave without pay because the paperwork was too much and he had a lot of money saved up. And that was the only thing I heard that was kind of like, well, that's kind of weird, but okay. But again, none of those are red flags. None of those are major things. They're going to make you think that he's going to do what he did.
And you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, Steve. Obviously, it's probably something that still haunts you to this day, right? So you've gone over these details in your mind many, many times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And those were the only two things, which, I mean, on the surface as we hear them, is that, would we raise the red flag and go, this person is an insider, right? Probably.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. We did have conversations about civil liberties, and we had conversations about the Fourth Amendment and those sorts of things. But it was clear he was big into privacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the job interview that we had with him, he outlined and talked about his expertise using Tor. He claimed to know a 0-day within Tor. He loved internet anonymization and encryption. He was an expert in those sorts of things. I know he got in a training session with my training director. They kind of got in a debate about civil liberties and privacy and those sorts of things. But again, even though we worked at NSA, those aren't reasons, A, not to hire people, or B, not to trust somebody. I mean, in my mind, it was NSA cleared him. He'd been working at NSA or CIA for the previous 5 to 6 years. And I hope, like any organization, that you would hire a diversity of different mindsets and thoughts. Because one of the most unhealthy things a place like NSA could do is hire a bunch of like-minded people who view the world the same way. And that's going to result in bad analysis, bad conclusions, et cetera, right? So when we have these conversations and he brings up privacy and the Fourth Amendment, and he brings up Tor and those things, especially the Tor piece, I didn't view it as much as a negative, but even more of a positive from the tech side, right? I mean, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. He knows his way around the internet. He knows the cybersecurity, et cetera.
Quick question. Do you see a good way to kind of determine or not have false positives around someone that is privacy minded versus like patriotic versus like an insider threat that has kind of key indicators? What are some of those markers that maybe experience has now led you to be able to hone in on?
Yeah, that's a great question. When it comes from people who are privacy focused and minded, or the civil liberties piece, I mean, there's kind of two different mindsets, but often overlap to some extent as well, right? From a privacy side, I think for a lot of us who aren't as privacy focused, I guess, and not that we're not concerned about it, but it's not like a major component of us to some extent. Like I subscribe to the subreddit, privacy, right? And it's far beyond their concern about privacy than where I think about it, right? But for people like me that read those things and try to understand it, my initial thought is, well, they must be trying to hide something, right? Which often I find to be the wrong approach. Usually it's a measure of just wanting to protect themselves and believing that's a right that they have, and that's why they use Tor. They're so concerned about privacy. The Fourth Amendment piece is similar, right? We care about our freedoms, we care about our liberty, and this idea of security and freedom, they're diametrically opposed, right? The more secure you are, the less free you are. The more free you are, the less secure you are. And we have to find a balance in our society in terms of what makes sense. And now, how does that translate to insider threat? Well, they can be indicators to some extent if you're working in an environment like NSA, right, where privacy is a big issue. And technically, NSA's job is to violate foreign nationals' privacy, at least the ones that you're targeting under the priority intelligence requirements, et cetera, right? I mean, that's the whole point of espionage to some extent. So yeah, it could be an indicator, but what you're really looking for from an insider threat standpoint isn't so much what their ideology is, but I find one of the most effective ways, I guess, at least the way as I've thought about it, is looking for changes in behavior. Most of the time, most of your insiders, you're going to know them fairly well, and you're going to have worked with them for a period of time. And if at some point, unless they come in with the intent, then it's a little bit different. But even with Snowden, he came in with the intent and things changed quickly. And I'll get to that in a sec. But you look for changes in behaviors. Maybe they start working late. Maybe they start asking questions they never asked before, trying to see if they can get access to things they haven't had access to before. Various things like that. Are kind of things you look for, and oftentimes it's bad policy, right? But there's also kind of a gut feeling you get that, hey, something might not quite be right. And I know that's not very scientific, or I'm not going to put that in a book necessarily, but but the point is you're really looking for changes in behaviors. You're looking for from a behavior standpoint, I think that's probably the biggest element of it. And then also, depending on how well you know your people, are there changes in their lifestyle or in their personal lives that might drive a motivation for it? Like, for instance, at NSA and a lot of the security intelligence organizations, you have to do financial disclosures. They're looking for, are you in a financial situation that may make you vulnerable to foreign nationals feeding you a bunch of money for information, things like that, right? So, and that applies in any organization. If somebody's going through a divorce, if they're facing bankruptcy, whatever, those things can be drivers for insider threats as well. So it's not so much ideology as much as circumstance.
Stephen, was interesting. You said something just now about how there's a gut feeling, right? And how it's not necessarily like a great thing to put in a book. I think it should be. It's really ironic. I'm going back and watching Star Trek: The Next Generation. For whatever reason, I'm finding it wildly entertaining to go back and watch that. Specifically, the conversations that are focused around data, right? And Data and Geordi are having the exact conversation you were describing. They're diagnosing a problem, looking at all of the data points, and Geordi goes, "I don't know, my gut feeling just tells me to do this." And Data's like, "What do you mean?" Right? And he has to explain to Data that, like, there's this other element that we put into diagnosing a problem or coming up with a solution that's just like, it's a gut feeling and it's a feeling. And Data's like, well, I'll try and work on that. And Geordi's like, yeah, good luck with that, right?
Yeah, Paul, that's a good one from a book I'm reading currently, recommended by some folks at work, Left of Bang, which is kind of an interesting concept because you're moving left or moving right, and it sounds kind of like a DevOps practice type of thing, which you think about it really is, because you want to be ahead of a problem, so you're moving left. But they very much talk about that gut feeling in Left of Bang so that you can be ahead of a problem, and it's a real thing.
Which is interesting as we talk about, software solutions that use AI and machine learning to understand data points and observe behaviors. They still lack that gut feeling, right? You still need a human being to have that. So.
Now, just on that note.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to transition because also while you were talking, Stephen, the thing I'm also thinking of is now when we're talking about like what to look for, specific data points, gut feelings. Now with everyone working from home, it makes it, I think, so much more difficult to spot these things because now all of the people that work for you and all of your coworkers are remote. I mean, we talked about your experiences already with Edward Snowden. Now, you worked with him for a month as, he directly reported to you and there was no like immediate red flags. Now everyone's remote. Like how much of more of an opportunity does an insider have today?
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Is you kind of lose that gut feeling piece of it. I mean, a lot of insiders are detected because people that they work with observe a change in behavior or something doesn't feel right or there's just something wrong, right? And that's how a lot of these things at least start. It may not catch them per se, but it starts this chain that results in an investigation or things like that, right? Now, you obviously supplement with technology and processes, et cetera. But, like every organization on earth, we talk people, process, and technology, and that applies when it comes to detecting insider threats. And so when we look at this remote work environment that we're in today because of the pandemic, you lose primarily the kind of the human observation piece of it is lost. And then the second thing that it does for us is it makes unusual work hours and behaviors not so unusual, right? So I've been working remote for 2.5 years before the pandemic, right? Before, when I'd go into the office every day, I was there from 8 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m. I had my set hours. I kind of did the same thing, same general routines, those sorts of things. Now, I might work from 8 a.m. to noon. I might take 2 hours and go hang out with the kids, work in the yard, come back another time. Oftentimes I find myself logging out. I worked at night anyways, but find myself logging in often at 9 p.m., work until 2 a.m. or whatever it may be. And I'm doing things at a wider array of, different behaviors that makes machine learning a lot harder to model. So you lose a lot of that, both from a tech side and a people side with the remote work piece of it.
Also, the employees now are potentially isolated. So if they're, already feeling isolated. Maybe they've got an axe to grind. There's no one there with them physically in the office to be like things aren't that bad, or just like work things out, right?
Well, yeah, and even how they do it, right? If you apply that to the Snowden situation, right, where Snowden, he had to make up an excuse to come in late for work. He came and told me he had epilepsy, and he started going to doctor's appointments, which allowed him to come in at noon, and he'd work till 8 p.m. And it was a ghost town at NSA after 5:30 or 6.
Yep.
And it was during those couple of hours when no one was there that he could plug the thumb drive into his computer and download all this data. Now, with remote work, you don't have that observation piece, right? Snowden could spend all 8 hours for all anybody cared, just downloading all day in this sort of a circumstance.
Yep. Tyler?
You lose a lot of that technology security as well from the hardware standpoint. Like some of these places are relying on bring your own device or maybe hastily deployed remote devices that have to have lower security policies. And so the ability to control, media going in and out of a device, content being downloaded and moved around to another device, a lot of those security protections and even egress and firewall, like not that DLP does a whole lot, to be honest, but you lose some of those hard external filter policies, firewall policies, and things that look for that anomaly behavior. It's really difficult to do without the technology now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You lose so much control. Sure.
Jeff.
Yeah, I'm stewing here. I have a silly process question for you. Do contractors that work for NSA have to go through the same background investigation, including polygraph, to be able to work at NSA?
Yes, they do. It follows the same process, right? So the companies have to pay for it, but it goes through the same organization, same agency, same background process. They have to have the same level of polygraph and all of that. So it's not necessarily a decentralized process, aside from who pays for it. So yeah, you absolutely have to have the same clearance and same background checks.
So I guess the question that's just bugging me is, how did they miss him? How did they miss Snowden?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it?
And it's a rhetorical question. I'm not expecting you to answer.
But I'm sure Steven's thought about that same question too.
Oh, sorry, what was that?
I said I'm sure Steven's thought about that very same question as well. How did the other checks and balances miss this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things we can look at, right? One of the things that came out in the congressional investigation about Snowden was that apparently when he worked for CIA had flagged his clearance kind of at the near the end of his time at CIA, and whether it was because NSA started the clearance process, did their background check right before CIA. I can't remember the exact details. Right before CIA flagged it, or because the two organizations didn't really communicate and talk, which isn't very uncommon. I mean, there really is a rivalry, more or less, between the two organizations. NSA didn't ever see that flagging of his clearance. They didn't see those concerns, right? And so that was one of the big ways in which it got missed. Number two is thing that I've learned.
So let me interrupt and ask my question in a different way. Did he have to go through a polygraph to work at NSA, or what? Because he carried a clearance over from CIA, they just hadn't gotten around to it yet, or it was accepted. His clearance level was accepted, and the polygraph would be whatever the rotational is or was, and he'd pick it up later.
That is a good question. My understanding is that the clearance would have passed over, right? So they may not have needed to do a full, complete NSA background check.
Okay. So everybody knows the CIA sucks in terms of their background checks.
In case you hadn't noticed, Stephen, Jeff has come on the show and actually done 2 segments which were outstanding about his time at the NSA.
Yep.
Oh, great. Awesome.
Just kidding, all my friends out there at CIA. Not really.
Yeah. So my understanding is that NSA and CIA require you to do their own polygraph when you come over.
So the polygraph has to be conducted, but the clearance level, some level of clearance may transfer, which may forego some further background investigation independent of the polygraph.
Yeah. NSA would have still done some sort of background investigation, but it may not have been quite as thorough as somebody coming off the street, right?
Right.
So That's where the difference and we're unknown about.
Well, and
Sorry about
I'm
my
not going to
bandwidth
say
for all
what all
this.
the
It looks
I'm
like
not going to
there's
say what
bandwidth issues. I
the
apologize.
there's different focuses of the background investigation. I don't know if they're public knowledge or not. I'm not going to mention them. Let's just say there's several, just in case. And during re-investigations, when you already had a clearance, at least at my time at NSA, the full polygraph wasn't done. It was more focused, let's say. So I wonder if it's a possibility that the presumption was that the full background investigation, including the full polygraph, was done prior, poorly by CIA, obviously, and then maybe it was just a limited view, which may not have covered the elements that were most germane to what Snowden ended up being.
But it's a good point, Jeff, and it begs the question, Stephen, as Edward is you're his manager, right? All you know is pass fail from these checks. You don't get any insights as to what was conducted during testing or what the results were, right? That's someone, another group of people's job. All you know is pass or fail, correct?
That's right. And even especially as a contractor, right? I wasn't a government employee, so I was even privy to less information. Now, Booz Allen did their own sort of initial basic background check, but it's not a whole lot different than what any corporation would do.
Sure.
Right? It wasn't a security clearance type thing either. So yeah, we were even privy to less info as contractors.
Gotcha. So I want to come back to, those of us working from home, and how do we monitor the situation today for our employees and be able to detect or have some indication that someone could be an insider when everyone is working remote?
Well, that's a really good question. And that's a big, hard problem that a lot of people organizations are asking themselves today, right? And some of the problem was outlined earlier, which is we're installing all of this technology very rapidly. And not only is it leaving us open to insiders, but it's leaving us potentially vulnerable to other cyber attacks, right? And you lose control of that data. And I would say, you essentially, with the move to the cloud, with the move to Zoom, any sort of monitoring detection you can do of logs from those systems would be valuable, right? You probably want to increase the level of monitoring you have of files being downloaded off of your Office 365 or AWS or cloud environments or off your servers, and identify, hey, who's downloading more data than we've seen in the past, those sorts of things. And then you probably want to, I know that, the DLP tools and those sorts of things are, they can be hit or miss in how quality they are, but probably hardening and strengthening the workstation security that your employees are using would be useful as well, right? It's ensuring you have a strong antivirus and a state up to date. Endpoint protection kind of layered on top of that, and DLP can also assist with that. And then aside from that, I would say it's probably worthwhile to do a review and an update of your identity and access management policies. Review who has admin, who doesn't, who has access to certain applications, and making sure that the level of access for an employee matches their need to know, so to speak, for their job. And that's probably the most effective way you can do it. I mean, there are some apps out there that are kind of like pseudo spyware that you can install on mobile devices or computers that will basically document everything they do on that computer and how long they're on it and all of that. And if that's how deep you want to get to ensure the security, you're welcome to. I don't think it necessarily builds the right culture, and it really sends the message you want. But there's that level too. But I mean, I think it just goes to continuing your monitoring and detection, but altering it and updating it to maximize the tools and processes that are being used more often with the remote work.
Lee?
So I was thinking about, historically, we'd set up all the workstation monitoring stuff to work well within our perimeter, and or if we had VPN connected. Do you think people are moving so that they are functioning irrespective of the VPN, so that it doesn't matter whether I'm formally online or not, I can still keep track of the machines? Or are people even thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely thinking about it. How to execute it or to what extent that investment's worth it is a different question. I know with my work computer, I can connect to VPN or disconnect it, but my Skype is always up. My Outlook's always up. People know if I'm on or I'm not on unless I close those down, even with or without being on VPN. So there are ways to monitor it and check it without the VPN. But you're right. On a home network in particular, you think about all the different devices from a security standpoint that are using it. I've got 5 kids and they're all doing remote school and they're all on Zoom and they're all using, these various technologies, and we're all on one home network, right? I mean, to what extent should you require your employees to segment their home network on their router, give themselves a dedicated VLAN or something that they then VPN from, and that way nothing can get transferred off a work computer, et cetera. Those are all little things you can do to kind of increase your security generally, but also from an insider to try to prevent, say, transfer of data and all that. But the reality is you lose a lot of control, a lot more control than you had in the office when people are working remote. And it's just a matter of what level of risk are you willing to live with.
Yeah, that's why I'm a huge fan. When you talked about this last week too, of if you have remote workers, sending them a physical hardware device. And that's the device they use as a gateway, whether it's a wireless access point or whatever. It's a physical device. If you want access to the resources of the organization you work for, you have to connect either wireless or wired to that device, and it has some protections. It's not a perfect solution, but when we talk about these remote working security issues, I kind of come down to I think this is a really good solution for that. It's not perfect, but I think it's really good.
So no, and I agree. I think that's a smart move. I think the only challenge you have is scalability, right? If you have 20,000 employees, are you going to be willing to spend that money?
No, it's true. Absolutely. Sorry, Tyler. There's a little delay with Steven. So we're not having awkward conversations. There's a delay in Steven's internet connection. So Tyler.
So question kind of around the insider threat. So take that a step further. What do you see as, having gone through this, what do you see are kind of appropriate measures and next steps once the insider threat is identified? But also, like, what do you do with that data, or how do you handle that incident as it's occurring? Obviously, firing them's a logical answer, but that may not always be the best, choice and or series of events that you do, and the order you do that in, it is very important. So can you walk us through some of your experience and your take around some of that?
So I want to just add something to Tyler's question, because it was one of my burning questions for Steven that I had not considered, having read so many things and watched all the documentary films about Edward Snowden, and I had never considered that Edward worked for someone and then was identified as the mole, and that someone that he worked for, when that happened, would be questioned by someone. And how did that all play out, right? That was a genuine curiosity of mine.
Yeah, that's both great questions and great points. Let's see. So I guess going back to the first one and tying all that together. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Can you repeat the first part of that question?
Yeah, sorry. Now that they're probably two different questions. Okay, Tyler, let's redo. Okay, Tyler, you go first.
Sorry, Tyler.
No problem. Yeah, I was just kind of curious, like, what your take was from an experience standpoint of how to deal with an insider threat as it's occurring, and then B, kind of the steps that you take as the data is either being exfilled or has been exfilled. Kind of what is the logical things that you see as good measures to do, and maybe lessons learned, maybe things that weren't done great.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. So it really depends on what the desired obviously the desired outcome is to stop the loss of data, but is the desired outcome to stop it and just fire the guy, or is the desired outcome a desire to stop it, fire the guy, arrest him, and press charges, right? I think there's a little bit of a different element there. And also you need to consider what's the risk, is there a risk to us to taking further action against this person? Kind of like how Snowden said, hey, if anything happens to me, I've got multiple copies of this data spread out that I don't have control of anymore. If something happens to me, all this stuff gets released and more than what it already has, right? Something like that, right? So there's a level of all these things you have to take into consideration. I would say if your intended goal is just, we got to protect the data and we're just going to fire the guy, is you need to have enough evidence on hand to justify the firing. That's number one, right? So it's easy to say, I've got a good feeling about this guy. Oh, I saw Frank over there plugging a thumb drive in his computer, and having other circumstantial evidence. But you really need to have almost like, it's a standard incident response to some extent, right? You need to have an evidentiary chain in which you're logging activities. You're able to point to logs, or point to incidents on the network where they're downloading mass amount of data, or they're injecting some code into a database, whatever it may be, right? And collecting an adequate enough level of evidence in order to justify firing them from an HR standpoint, if that's what you need. Some places you can just fire for the sake of firing. But one of the things I would do, though, if you want to stop that level of exfiltration, but yet not ready to reveal your hand, would be to kind of like I don't know if it's psyops or just deception game, right? But where maybe you put blocks or you change rules or those sorts of things to stop the data from being able to be downloaded, or just make it more difficult in the name of, hey, we're updating our security policies and these are some of the actions we're taking. And then you can try to capture that person trying to do a workaround on it, right? So you can point to that while also protecting the data. And then if you want to kind of take it further and you're looking to not only fire the guy, but press charges, especially if, I've probably seen more articles in the last year and a half of people being arrested for intellectual property theft on behalf of China than I have in the previous 10 years. I know it's happened all the time, but it's been a huge rush of them recently. In that sort of scenario, maybe not even that severe, but you want to be able to press charges and you need to take it further. It may be we need to keep giving them a little rope so they can hang themselves even more and more, right? So I would say reasonable responses, I would say the beginning, which I didn't touch on yet, is almost a subtle way of, hey, doing some maybe ancillary training for the whole team on insider threat and data theft and those sorts of things, and seeing if that gets the message across, and making sure they understand what's right and wrong. Maybe it's having the direct manager, if that's not you, do a question of, hey, I've noticed that you've been working a little later recently. What's going on? And just kind of pointing out changes in their behaviors that may get them a little squirmy to think that maybe you're on the case, right? And see if that stops it. And then continue in the monitoring, the evidence gathering, so on and so forth.
Yeah, Stephen, and my question should have been asked after you answered Tyler's question, and that was, once there is an incident, right? Obviously, you want to stop any further leaks and also conduct an investigation. Obviously, in your case, and as with many cases in the federal government and agencies within the U.S. and other countries, there's a very specific investigation that has to take place. You don't have to tell the whole story, right? But I think it's very interesting when we think about it this way. Like, how quickly were you contacted, and who contacts you, and then what's the post-mortem look like in this scenario?
Yeah, and in my situation, it was very quick, right? It was Sunday morning. The news came out that it was Snowden that was behind these things. The first people that reached out to me were all my Booz Allen bosses, and all the way up to the executive level of Booz Allen. Is this our guy? And wanting confirmation on things. Mm-hmm. And then probably 4 or 5 hours later, Sunday afternoon, and that same day, I got a call from NSA Security who said that, hey, we want to meet you with the FBI down at the FBI offices in Kapolei, which is a city in Hawaii. And I went down and I was grilled, right? And they were pretty cool about it. Like, I specifically remember driving down to those offices, like half in a panic attack. I've seen all the movies, right? I know what to expect when you're being interrogated, as I thought it was going to be, by the NSA and FBI, and hot lamps shining on me in a dark room with people I can't see. And luckily it wasn't anything like that. But it was 3 or 4 hours of being asked a ton of questions about how long I'd known him, what did I know, and those sorts of things. And the nice thing is nobody really suspected that I was involved. Nobody believed I was from the beginning, which was nice. There wasn't a lot of accusation, but there was a lot of needing to know for sure and checking the boxes and making and doing their due diligence. And then obviously knowing what I know just generally for the investigation. But then even then, it doesn't stop there, right? For me. Obviously, the next couple of weeks and months are very difficult. But from the beginning, from the moment that I heard the news that Snowden was behind it, I just figured I was going to be the scapegoat, right? I figured Congress would want somebody that they could point to and say, hey, we fired the man that hired Snowden, right? So they could say, hey, we're doing our due diligence, whether it was warranted or not. And I don't hold any angst towards me kind of being removed from the agency. Sure enough, 2.5 months later, or maybe a month and a half later in late July, I had another call from NSA and FBI and went down and chatted with them. And this time they had a big binder, right? That, one of those big 3-ring binders, and it had all those little legal tabs and had my name on it, Steve Bay. And every email that I'd sent from NSA, I'm not talking about like my personal email, but all my NSA net email and my text, my Skype messages, and all those sorts of things, all my communication, everything I did at NSA for a period of time were in this thing. And I can't get into the details of it, but there was one incident that I had with Snowden where I gave him a piece of data that he shouldn't have had access to. It was pretty minor, but it was enough of a justification for them to temporarily remove my access to the agency. And the next day I had to go into the office and escorted by 2 security guards and with a brown box and did the walk of shame and all of that. And that was very uncomfortable, and kind of went from there and lost my access, and thereby ended up losing my contract job for NSA with Booz Allen. But Booz Allen was great, and they took care of me. And I was able eventually to move over to the commercial side of Booz Allen, and kind of went from there, got me into commercial cybersecurity. But there were 2 to 3 months where I was, moving into my grandparents' basement in Utah with my 4 kids and wife, trying to figure out what to do for work because of it all, right? And so I know Snowden, one thing I applaud Snowden for, from a personal standpoint, is he's never outed anybody he worked with. He never pointed fingers saying these guys did this and these guys did that. He was pretty respectful of all the people he knew and worked for on an individual level. But at the same time, there are very real, collateral damage, I guess is the way to put it, from these sorts of circumstances that you have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Jeff?
Not that I have had a dissimilar experience or anything. I'm just curious, how thick was the binder that they walked in with?
It was one of those big, thick ones. I think it was like one of those 3-inch ones, right? That was a. I
had a 5-inch. Mine was bigger.
That's not something to be proud of, guys. Just saying.
So we talking earlier about clearances, background investigations, and how prevalent that is in jobs in the government where they're doing classified. You're now over in the private sector, excuse me. Right. And I'm thinking that's a huge safety net, which obviously didn't work in Snowden's case, but is there sufficient assurance on human behavior in the private sector, or is there something missing there? Is there a parallel?
Yeah, there's a parallel for sure. And I think if I understand your question, right, it's asking, is there a similar parallel with, human assurance, insider threat, and is there appropriate concern on the commercial side from insider threat as there is on the public?
Bingo.
Did I capture that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So yes and no, right? Every company is concerned about the insider threat to some extent, but it's interesting, even at NSA, you have to balance culture with security. If you go, I know we have this concept in IT and in security of zero trust, and that's great from a technology standpoint. But when we apply a zero trust in terms of our employees, you end up creating this culture where nobody trusts each other, nobody enjoys work, and those sorts of things. And you have to balance that. And that's one of the biggest challenges I've seen CISOs deal with, is how do I implement adequate, solid security and protect ourselves from insider threats? Because insider threats aren't just these malicious guys like Snowden. It's your ignorant employees, not to be derogatory or anything, but who don't know how to identify a bad email from a good email. And they're clicking on most of your data breaches are coming from insider threats because you click on that email or you insecurely browse the web. And you have to balance, as a security leadership, these risks of security with maintaining a culture of trust and engagement and information sharing and those sorts of things, right? And one of the big criticisms of NSA post 9/11 was that they didn't do, and not just NSA, but the intelligence community, was we didn't do enough intelligence sharing, and we weren't collaborative enough, and we were in our silos too much. So all those things start breaking down. But as you break those silos down, you're then increasing the security risk of data being leaked, with more people having access to things and viewing things and having information and knowledge and people getting access to stuff. And so it's a really difficult balance that the government has to deal with, as well as corporate enterprise and private enterprise to do it. And I think some companies put a lot of investment into it, like financial services, because they know they have to. And other ones, like some of your smaller businesses, it's not as big of a concern because it's just a risk they have to live with, because they don't either A, have the money to deal with it, B, have the IT talent or security talent to do it, or C, it's just when they do their risk assessments, it's just lower on the totem pole, I guess.
So I got another question on that. Do you see all the kind of zero trust model making it easier to identify insider threats, or do you find that making it much more difficult to find the insider threats because it's eliminating to a certain extent some of the temptation or opportunity, whatever it may be. But identifying those early and or seeing and spotting those is really difficult with zero trust, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hadn't really thought of it, but I think if you're looking, depending on how you're monitoring it all, right, and how you're tracking it, it could make it easy if you're looking at the denies and you're looking at the behaviors that are being blocked, right? If you're seeing people trying to do end arounds on things and you keep seeing this weird behavior, this person trying to get access to something that keeps getting blocked because you've put all this zero trust technology in to limit to keep things very tight, very limited. If you're monitoring for that, it can give you those early indications of it, but you do potentially lose some of the ability to detect in terms of things like if you have kind of a more open environment of people accessing and doing mass downloads, all of that might be blocked and prevented, which is good, but bad for detecting somebody with ill intent. And one of the things that I've learned about insider threats, and really anybody with malicious intent, whether it's, say, terrorism or a physical security insider threat or whatever, once somebody has a plan to do something and they intend to do it, it's very difficult to stop it. Now, you might slow it down. You might make their life more difficult. You may even catch them. But short of catching them, ultimately at some point, it's kind of like the hackers, right? They're going to get in eventually. It's just a matter of how long can we delay it and or can we catch them and stop them in the act of doing it before they're successful at it. But as long as that ball keeps rolling down the road without being caught and stopped, eventually they'll find the success with zero trust or without it.
Stephen, for our audience's benefit, I wanted to just address an issue that I think is going through a lot of people's minds. Edward Snowden gave a talk at the Hope Conference to a round of extremely loud applause and cheering. When I talk to people who work for the U.S. government in the D.C. area, very much the opposite reaction. So clearly people have there are two different camps in terms of viewpoints of this. Where do you fall on that? And I think I asked you this question before, but if you could have a conversation with Ed today, how would that go?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely in the kind of anti-Ed camp to some extent, and certainly, at least in terms of what he did, right? Like, I'm pretty sympathetic on the Fourth Amendment piece, the privacy piece, civil liberties. Those are things that I subscribe to, right? Like, if I have to choose between freedom and liberty and security, I'm going to choose freedom and liberty. I'm willing to live with the risk of a terrorist attack to be able to maintain some of my more liberties and freedoms and those sorts of things, right? So I align pretty closely with him on that. And some of the things he said recently, out in the news about, the governments are going to use this pandemic and things to further erode civil liberties and all that are things that I'm sympathetic to, right? So in that regard, I appreciate his voice in that area. But when it comes to the rationale for doing what he did in terms of stealing all this data, being called a whistleblower and those sorts of things, my sympathy stops there, right? It's things like, one, he never went through any proper channels to be a, quote, whistleblower while in NSA to try to raise the flag of what he saw were abuses, right? Despite his claims, the investigation proves that out, and never once did he come to me or anybody else in NSA and say, hey, I'm seeing these things. It's a little, I don't think that's right? So he never kind of went through those official channels when we talk about whistleblower stuff. But that's kind of tangential. I can understand somebody saying, hey, if I go raise the flag here, I become under suspicion, and I get, there might be ramifications for that affect my career, et cetera. So I can understand that. But it's things like, he's a whistleblower where his stated motivation was essentially, I'm here to reveal to the American people abuses perpetrated on them by their government, right? Essentially domestic surveillance of Americans. That's what his stated motivation was. But when you go through all the releases of the things that he did, that he released or the media released on his behalf, there were maybe 2 or 3 articles, maybe like 2 to 5% of everything he released had anything remotely to do that could have been construed as domestic surveillance, domestic collection. The rest of it was perfectly legal, and within NSA's charter, foreign intelligence activities, right? It's targeting foreign countries, whether it's their governments or hacking computer systems, whatever they may have been in terms of what was released. All of those things were within NSA's charter. So if Snowden were truly as altruistic as he said he was, and his intent wasn't to harm national security, and it was to reveal to the American people the abuses perpetrated on them by the American people or by the American government, he never would have allowed released anything that had to do with NSA's legitimate foreign intelligence collection. And you would have just only pertained to that. And ultimately, if he ever comes back, gets brought back to the U.S. and he goes on trial, I think it's that fact. It's the fact that 95% of what he released was perfectly legal foreign intelligence is what ends up convicting him in the end. Had he just stuck with his altruistic vision and motivation for what he did and only released things pertaining to that, then I think there's a chance he'd be acquitted and kind of justified as the hero that he is. And that's kind of my perspective.
And I think that the media and a lot of the details that are out there are lots of details, I guess is my point, right?
Yeah.
And having some of the books I've listened to, not read, to Jeff's point, right? Yeah. Listened to, have gone into a lot of those very, very fine details about how the laws changed and were aligned with the charters of various government agencies in the past 20 years. There's a lot of details in there, right? And I agree with what you said, Stephen, that NSA is given a charter, and based on what Jeff has shared with us and our audience as well, I think that you have to dig into those details and also realize that everyone that works for the NSA, as an example, is not out to spy on American citizens and violate the law. That's not their charter, right? Their charter is to protect us.
Well, and not only that, right? One of the things Snowden fails to address is give any context. He A, doesn't give context to things that were released, and B, he never talks about what NSA did to try to protect it. I mean, I can't tell you how many trainings I had from oversight and compliance that said, this is how you handle data. This is what you're allowed to do. You're not allowed to spy on Americans. You're not allowed to spy on our Five Eye country partners. You can't, not only can you not spy on those folks, you have to stay within your lane of what your mission is as an intelligence analyst. If your mission is Bangladesh president or something, I don't know, pick some random thing out of a hat, you can't go doing intelligence queries and searches on the president of Paraguay, right? That's not allowed, right? And you have auditors that are reviewing your queries and those sorts of things, right? So there are security processes in place. And were there abuses done? Yes, right? That Clapper admitted as much, and there are abuses there, but there isn't, at least I've never seen, maybe I'm the guy that's wrong, but I never saw once any intent on NSA to spy on Americans in any way, shape, or form, to gather data on every single person in the world and have a dossier on them, and all these things that have been claimed, not necessarily just by Snowden, but by the people that are kind of on that side of the house. And that's one of my big frustrations. And that ties to one of the things I think is systemic within society today, is that nobody really cares about nuance, right? I give these talks all the time. I talk in conferences. I've had conferences in Seattle where it's a big pro-Snowden crowd, and I've ended up in debates during dinner later with these guys who love Snowden saying how I'm wrong. And I'm like, wait, I lived it. Like, I know what I'm talking about. And I've been in presentations in DC with a lot of anti-Snowden folks, right? And we have conversations. But what I'm seeing in society is if it can't be explained and consumed within 140 characters on Twitter, nobody really cares. Nobody really cares about the nuance of what really is going on and what really happened. And that's been one of the most frustrating things, is they just make these blanket statements that Snowden said this and Snowden did that, or NSA is doing this, without ever really drilling down into what the root of the true story is, if that makes sense, right? And that's been one of the hardest things and biggest frustrating things to try to overcome through all this.
So from your personal opinion, do you think Snowden was truly a privacy advocate or crusader, or do you think he was actually out to make money and get famous by doing what he did? Like, I know that there's probably kind of two pieces to that, but I'm curious what your take is.
I'm following you perfectly. It's sort of on the first part of the question, no on the second. I don't think he was driven by media and fame. I do believe he's a narcissist, but I don't have to believe he's a narcissist. He's a narcissist. He kind of had this mentality that I see an abuse, and I'm the only one that can correct that abuse. It falls on me, right? And he had to take the action. But was he completely altruistic? I have no evidence necessarily contrary to what he says about his driving motivation. I fully believe the way his stance is on privacy and civil liberties and the Fourth Amendment. Like, I think that is all legitimate within him. However, I have some reason to believe there's some research done a couple of years back. In fact, part of a documentary that I participated in from a company out in the Netherlands. It really only got released, I think, in like Denmark and Norway or whatnot. But where it was a psychologist type company that looked at psychology of insider threat and really honed in on Snowden pretty heavy. And one of the things that they revealed was that he may have been one of the early members of, I think, the group Anonymous, if I'm remembering right, and really engaged online since maybe as early as 2005, 2004 timeframe. And as I've thought about that, it wouldn't surprise me, and I'm specifically wording it this way because I don't want to come across as this is what happened, because this is just a theory that I have, and that what I think likely happened is, I personally think it's likely that Ed may have been an unwitting agent of a foreign power to some extent, right? Where perhaps in all of his online engagement, especially if he was involved with Anonymous really early on, that he let out of the hat who he was and what his job was, that he worked at CIA or NSA or whatnot, and that he may have been befriended by a foreign intelligence service that may have helped kind of coax him and drive him to do what he did. Now, again, I won't say I have no evidence of this, but it's very scant and nothing that I really can point to firmly. But I don't know that I fully buy into his complete altruistic, I guess his complete altruistic point of view, I guess motivation, I should say.
That's really interesting. As we've just we've interviewed former CIA agent we had the discussion about how you take a person and turn that person into an asset, right? And in this case, it could be the reverse, right? Is your theory, right? We're not saying we have hard evidence, but it could be the reverse, that an actor of a foreign nation turned Ed into an asset unknowingly, and that's the nuance that we talked about in our interview with Peter, right? Was working an asset as a CIA agent, working an asset, having them give you information, and unknowingly being a mole, right?
That's right. I mean, it could have just been befriended and saying, "Hey, and it could have been flaming the fires of the anti-NSA and civil liberties and privacy piece, and then saying, maybe feeding ideas of, hey, maybe you should do this, or you really should get that story out. You really should tell the world about this, and then kind of giving them tips on what's the right way to, like, going to Hong Kong was a smart idea. Like, that was genius. Like, that's, if you had to go anywhere in the world, that's the place to go to do what he did, right? So there's a lot of little things. That's just one small example. That, did he come up with that on his own? Maybe, but I think there was probably some assistance there that beyond what the journalist provided.
Right.
But who knows?
Interesting. Yeah. Stephen, on this show, we asked all of our guests who come on the first time 5 questions. So are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Let's do it.
3 words to describe yourself.
An explorer, motivated, and a good dad. I try to be anyway.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Oh, what would be my weapon of choice? Probably a sniper rifle. I don't know why. I mean, I played all those hunting games. I like being the sniper.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Probably something like A Conflicted Mind, something like that.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
I can't say that I've actually played it, but I'll go with second.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Live, dead, fiction, or otherwise.
2 celebrities to be my parents. I would probably say Michael Jordan, because of just his innate drive and motivation that probably I could have used some of that. His focus and drive, and then as the male and as a female,
doesn't have to be female, can be male.
It can be a male too.
Female, yeah.
So Michael Jordan, and probably, I don't know. I'm kind of leaning towards like a Winston Churchill kind of guy, but I'm not sure why.
Cool. There you go. Excellent, Stephen. Thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it.
And without taking a short break, come back with our next guest talking about Layer 8. Stay tuned.